Join us now for the expert source for inside information on the options markets. It's time for Options Insider Radio with your host, Mark Longo.
Welcome back to the Options Insider's exclusive coverage of the 2009 Options Industry Conference. Coming up next, we have the International Linkages and Multi-Product Clearing Panel. Panelists for this session include Michael Cahill from the Options Clearing Corporation, Pete Axelrod from the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, Mark Huglin from LCH ClearNet Limited, and Dale Michaels from CME Group. There were a few hiccups with the microphones for these Track B sessions, so we're actually going to start the audio for this panel in progress. Thanks again for listening, and stay tuned to theoptionsinsider.com for more exclusive coverage of the 2009 Options Industry Conference.
Better for in a clearinghouse rather than just see that alone at AIG. What scares me about it is that anytime you talk about bringing in a multitude of instruments is the pricing of these things. I mean, clearing doesn't necessarily solve all the pricing issues. You look at some of these illiquid markets, and we will come up with daily prices, but it's still a matter of coming up with broker quotes, and if it's not a central limit order book where you're having multitude of bid-offer spreads, you are basically marking the model for a lot of these instruments. And as bad as that sounds, that's the best you could do a lot of the times. And you're only as good as the information you're getting when you look to liquidate this type of wide portfolios and you're at a clearinghouse. You haven't necessarily solved the problem if you don't have good price information.
Mark or Pete, you want to take it?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it, how we're into one of those phases where the only clearing conversation that anybody wants to have is you're too expensive. To a situation now where clearing's held up as being the cure from everything from the common cold to world famine, and that's the swine flu as well. And that presents tremendous opportunity on the one hand, because you imagine a queue of asset classes for clearing organisations to get their teeth into. On the other hand, the devil's in the detail with this stuff. And it's just not as straightforward as everybody from regulators, or as pointed out on the previous panel, anybody that's just looking for something to blame and some box to tick to cure all these problems. And again, CDS will keep coming up as the prime example of this process, because it's the one that we've all been focusing on for so long. And for example, the difference between dealing with what is a fairly generic index product as part of CDS, and how the differences between that and taking that one stage further and dealing with the whole single names issue, they're two enormously different things. And to imagine that they can just be picked up and popped into a cleared model is a tremendous oversimplification. And the focus Dale's already mentioned on pricing and what to do with off-the-run series and so on and so forth is one thing. The piece of that for me is always dramatically oversimplified is the whole process of default management. Because if you're not careful with these things, what you end up doing is moving from a situation where there's counterparty risk on an OTC basis that can, under some circumstances, do great damage to individual institutions, and you end up creating a situation, if you're not careful, where you've created the systemic possibility of going one stage further and bringing down a clearinghouse. You've got to have somewhere to put this stuff and a structure that can deal with this stuff as and when something goes wrong. Otherwise, moving something into clearing at the same time as weakening the very structural base of that clearing product gets you absolutely where you don't want to be.
I guess since it's Saturday morning and we've got such a large audience, I'll be a little bit provocative. I'll limit my comments to credit default swaps and just throw out some interesting tidbits. Right now, there are 7, count them, 7 separate clearing initiatives. Only one actually has product going through it at the moment, but there will be more. In many cases, due to a tiff between European and U.S. regulators, the same company is providing 2 separate products, one in Europe and one in the U.S., but they have to be kept corporately separate. And in one case, the same company is providing 2 separate products in Europe. There's, again, for sort of geopolitical reasons. I don't want to comment any further other than the fact that this is a global market, but regulation is national at best, is somewhat complicating the picture, and one might question whether that's actually creating some operational risk that doesn't need to be created. So that's the first point about credit default swaps. The second is that you need to be clear about what problem you're trying to solve by having clearing or exchanges. In fact, the infrastructure, the basic confirmation, post-trade processing infrastructure in place for credit default swaps globally is as efficient as stock markets. That's a fact. If you look at the confirm rates for U.S. equities trading, about 70% is confirmed on trade date and the rest thereafter, because dealer-customer trades still generally are not confirmed on trade date. That is the same for the credit default swap market globally today. Just slightly south of 70% are confirmed on trade date, with the rest confirmed on T+1 or later. That's globally. There is central asset servicing for credit default swaps today. There is multilateral net cash settlement globally for credit events. So what's missing in the infrastructure? There's also, by the way, as opposed to any other OTC market, complete transparency today around inventory and turnover globally. We publish that weekly. We're going to start publishing that daily. So what's left for clearing, and I'll get to exchange trading in a second, is to, today all of the risks are managed on a bilateral basis and margined on a bilateral basis. And to some extent, what I think regulators have determined is that it would be good to have a credit ring, which is the effect of a central counterparty clearing service, so that if a major dealer goes under, essentially the risks of default on the cleared trades go back to the credit ring and not directly to the regulators. I would point out that finally, with respect to AIG, that none of the contracts that were creating the issues with AIG, the credit default swaps, would have been eligible for clearing. They were all non-standard. They were all long-form contracts, and the problem there wasn't that they existed, but that they were not margined. So what I would suggest finally there is that the answer to that sort of thing, since I think bilateral credit default swaps serve a very useful purpose, they're the only pure way of trading credit risks, they're a useful hedging tool, is if you had centralized, disciplined, and enforced and transparent bilateral margining process, so that it would be very clear when margin wasn't called for, wasn't paid when it was called for, and that the positions, which today in fact are now transparent to the regulators, would make it not only the positions but the valuations and whether or not they're margin transparent to the regulators. You would then find that some of these credit issues would go away. Went on for a little bit.
Oh, Peter, that's wonderful. We have about 20 more minutes to fill before we go hear the Najarian brothers, so we have plenty of time. Dale, would you like to push the button, Dale?
Push the button. All right. You talk about the bilateral margin process. Maybe just to ask you a question there. Do you really think that the bilateral margin would go into the market and affect everyone the same way? I mean, I kind of look at it as we talked to, obviously credit default swaps is something that has been pretty interesting for the CME, but you talk to the margins that a Citadel might have paid for a credit default swap versus sell side, which is paying nothing, versus other buy side dealers, which is paying a great deal of margin. And it seems that if a bilateral type of world where you did have, a margin policy, I think you'd end up being in a place where there'd be preferred treatment at some place, as opposed to if you had a clearinghouse set the margins at a clearing level and at the customer level, you'd be able to have one margin policy that everyone can go to, such as you see with the securities today.
Yeah, I guess I think that's all in the realm of initial margin. I think when you're looking at variation margin, in fact, since all the trades today are currently registered in a central warehouse, it's not a stretch to have independent valuations provided by market or some other company on all these trades and have the variation margin calculated every day and moved automatically, just like we centrally move settlements. The issues, I agree with you, the issue is going to arise in the area of initial margin, where today hedge funds typically are charged initial margin, dealers are not. They don't charge each other. Larger traditional investment managers such as PIMCO and BlackRock are not charged initial margin either. I think all of that's, I think what clearing's going to do is actually move the bilateral trades where everybody's charging everybody initial margin. I agree that you may have to address the issue, well, what if initial margins charged differentially? I would submit that with 7 different central counterparties offering product out there, you may have that problem today anyway.
Mark, like to opine?
Yeah, I think while Pete's comment is absolutely right, I think it's very unlikely that when this plays itself out, that the liquidity ends up being split between 7 different solutions. Whether there's a geographical split between, for example, Europe and the US is one thing, and the regulators will push that piece through. The issue of margining is fascinating because the portfolio effect of CDS, probably more than anything else, and this is very much more your field of expertise than mine, but in a portfolio where that is not very diversified, that is made up, let's say, of a large short position in not very many, let's call them investment banks for want of, or motors or what have you. What would be your view in terms of the rates of margin that you would need to charge in order to be happy that you are getting adequate risk management done? And is there not a tipping point where it just becomes uneconomic because you're getting so close to 100% of the contract value being lodged with you that it might as well stay in its current structure?
It's interesting. There hasn't been a regulator that hasn't found CDS very interesting. We've had the SEC, the FINRA, CFTC, FSA, all have shown up knocking on our door, and we welcome them in to talk about margins. And a couple of their early on proposals when talking about margins was very much a rules-based, why don't you charge everything 25% or 15% or 20%, whatever it might be. And we worked very hard to get folks off of that and say what we really need for this market is a portfolio type of approach that takes in the risk of diversification for portfolios that do have a lot of instruments where it's unlikely that all 50 instruments are going to default at the same time, but can capture those type of portfolios you just mentioned where there is very much a skewness where you only have maybe 3 or 5 or 7 very concentrated short positions and very few long positions or financial types of positions, which obviously took a bath this past year. So we've, at CME, we've come up with an approach where looking at those types of risk, idiosyncratic risk, and come up with a margin model that could take that in effect and recently been approved by the regulators so that it goes beyond just a rules-based, for a large diversified portfolio, it'll be 2%, 3%, but for those skewed portfolios, it'll go up to 15%, 16%, and so it captures that type of risk. And it's coming up with the margins for the Indices is fairly easy. Coming up with ones for single names is geometrically more difficult. So it's one that's we've been grappling with for quite a while. And then you mentioned default management. Again, for indices and for the products that have prices, very easy. For the single names and when you're marking a model on some of these prices, a little bit more difficult.
It's been very good. I actually am tempted just to sit out in the audience. It'd be easy for me to hear. Let these you get three great panelists that they can just ask each other questions and debate the issues is wonderful. While we're on that, want to get to a couple of things, but while the topic of this or the panel is entitled International Linkages. Pete, you mentioned that 7 offerings in this world, and one of the issues you also mentioned that one of the problems is when you get non-standardized contracts. In linkages, and my first question about the call from regulators and politicians to a centralized clearing, what do you see the risk of where we go cross jurisdictions, where there's such gray, that you can now venue shop the major global organizations that are operating in every venue, that you could then say, I'm going to park these contracts into this clearing solution. I'm going to take these into that solution. Should we talk about a little bit about the risk of a fragmentation of the open interest and when you start taking bilateral risk and putting it into a multilateral structure, that the risk of the fragmentation of it. So let's jump on that one.
I'll put my previous head as a GCM on to comment, which is that I've never seen in the exchange traded world a link, and I'll pay due deference to Dale's link with Singapore, but for different reasons I don't classify that as a true linkage. Without exception, and again the previous panel made reference to it, and it's driven partly by regulatory issues here in the US for sure, but even elsewhere in the globe, I've yet to see one that has been in any way effective and non-painful from an operational perspective, that actually achieves what it set out to, other than doubtless a feeling of togetherness and potential down the line business opportunity for those that are putting those links in and together. In the environment that we now find ourselves, I think that inconvenience, if you like, it now pales into insignificance between other very real issues that we've all been thinking much more about in the last 9 or 12 months, which is the very fact that these things are in different spots around the globe creates other issues. There are spots, depending on what that clearing process is and how these contracts are moved and how offsets are being done, where there's pieces of time when these things are just being unmargined by anybody. And that can't be good. There are also jurisdictional issues and legal issues around the risk in the event of a default, of leakage, if you like, out of somebody else's jurisdiction, unless you're very clear and explicit about how those rules work and how the thing is tied together. I remain absolutely convinced that the best way to link things is to have them all cleared in the one spot, which is why I'm happy to nod in Dale's direction for that Singapore link, because rather than leaving two things together and then finding an artificial way of bringing them together, it provides that one opportunity at time of trade to put somewhere here or there, but once it's there, it stays there and gets margined as such. And I think there'll be, even if those are dealable with issues, there must now be an awful lot more circumspectness, if that's a word, on the part of any of the exchange and clearing houses before putting those things in. And I can't see there being a great rush for them unless there's a consolidation of clearing houses themselves.
Either Pete, Dale.
I'll jump on that. We have with the CME, I mean, we've taken over, we've merged with Board of Trade, we've merged with the New York Mercantile Exchange. We've brought a lot of the clearinghouses into one structure, which has been beneficial from the sense of saving the firms and the ultimate customers a great deal of money. What we've seen is that we look at things such as the risk and things such as guarantee funds that we all must have, and the amounts that we charge. We bring in different asset classes. There's a diversification effect from having those different asset classes. They tend not to move all at once, especially when you're looking at agricultural equities and different asset classes. They also don't tend to have the same players in each of the markets. So what may be the biggest player in the equity market tends not to be the biggest player in the agricultural market, which also tends not to be the biggest player in the metals or energy markets. So we've seen that diversification of risk and product so that we don't necessarily have to have multiple funds, multiple guarantee funds, so we can bring those funds down to a more reasonable level. Also, as far as operational processing, it helps to have the one processes. We talk about links. Do they? Is it because of jurisdictional issues or operational issues? I tend to think it's much more a regulatory concern as far as trying to bring those types of links together. Operations-wise, I mean, that's what clearinghouses do, is try to improve operations. We have smart people at the clearinghouses. Obviously not. Probably listening to us, it's probably not that evident, but we do tend to have smarter people than the people up here on the panel, myself certainly included in that, as far as smarter people back home. But they solve operational issues. It's the regulatory issues where we always have some more difficulties. We were talking with one clearinghouse in Brazil, and they margin things down to every individual customer level. And it's not something that we do here in the U.S. And we're trying to figure out how to give margin offsets, how to do default management procedures. And you start going into the regulatory body, start talking to the regulators, and it was the operational issues were pretty easy, and then you got to the regulatory issues, and it was much more of a complex.
I don't know that I have that much more to add. I do note that in Europe, where the Code of Conduct puts a heavy premium on interoperability and linkages between cash market clearinghouses, the European regulators in the context of credit default swaps have simply put linkages on the back burner because they viewed it as that complex.
You guys jumped right to the third question on our list that I'd sent out to them, skipping some of the others. On linkages, though, one of the questions I'd like to talk a bit about linkages. For example, OCC and in support of the ISC and Eurex have announced a bit over a year ago a linkage which would allow access to securities options contracts at ISC. So, in essence, a westbound link. The eastbound portion of that is held up by some regulatory issues. But one of the things that we have as a foundation there will be the operational connection with the clearinghouses that will have it. And again, when we talk about that, you talk about linkages, and we said the interoperability standards in Europe. There's been, as Mark referenced, the CME, CIMEX mutual offset system. When you talk about that, when we look at in all your experiences, when you have an idea of a linkage where there's not a symmetry where it can go both east-west equally, how do you overcome? How would you think you could overcome that? Or is it a matter, as I said, where it has to build over time? Should we go to the next question? No.
It's hard. I don't think it necessarily has to work in equal measure both ways in order to be interesting for both parties. The fact remains, though, that there's all of the legal issues, as they're referenced, just don't go away.
Yeah, and just looking at some of the other linkages that we talked about, the CIMEX Singapore mutual offset system. That's most of the business today tends to go one way. It still works. It's still a pretty clean system as far as trading in one venue, clearing at another venue. We've had, between OCC and CME and LCH and CME, we've had cross margin for quite some time, and they've had some traction in the area, but they've it's never blossomed into huge types of participants, and it seems to have gotten to a level and stayed there. And to really bring those type of linkages, it seems you need to bring in more of the customer types of activity. And again, that's when you start getting into the different regulatory issues as far as SEC, CFTC, FSA, and you bring in the regulators, and it tends to get into much lengthier discussions, more time and cost than I think many of us are willing to commit for certain benefits.
It is true that very rarely, and in fact, I'll shorten your discussion of my experience from several decades to a couple. But never in my experience have I seen a piece of business move from anywhere to anywhere else, or indeed an FCM win a piece of business on the back of a margin offset. It's something that everybody will tell you should exist in their neat copybook way in which things should be organised, and it's great when it's there, but I've never seen it make a difference.
Did somebody go to, while we're sitting here at the BlackBerry, go to Wikipedia and see whether several means more than one as opposed to couple is exactly 20? Two. But, okay, I'm going to, so we leave a little bit of time for questions. One more issue. We've talked, we've touched on it here. I haven't touched on it. These three have done all the work. The issue of, we've talked about diversifying your product base, multi-assets in a clearinghouse. Dale touched on it about the risk when you bring a new product in, and do you incorporate it into your existing default fund? There's a discussion a lot of times called build versus buy, where you go out and do you build a separate function? We have three well-established with many years of experience in this. But can you talk just briefly on the pros and cons, and as you debated, of when a new asset class is added to the clearing function, is it the benefits of isolating it from your existing as opposed to, as contrasted with allowing it to be included in the much bigger pool for efficiencies?
I'd be a huge proponent, where possible, of using and leveraging the same default fund. The real live example of that was in the case of the Lehman default. And without getting too specific, I can only tell you that what allowed us, and at that time having the complete range of asset classes from everything from the financials business in the life segment, through our equity clear service, through the OTC cleared products in repo clear and swap clear, but also the energy business, which was clear through us at that time. It was the very diversification of the entire Lehman portfolio with us that allowed for the process of dealing with that event to be as smooth as it was. There were points during those first couple of days when those portfolios were being dealt with, liquidated auctions, so on and so forth, where there were individual asset classes that were in almost free fall. What helped enormously was the safety net of having the other asset classes, which were absolutely not all monodirectional, providing the support for that process. Now, even though the default processes in each of those asset classes might have been different, so in our swap clear OTC service, for example, a very specific default management group in order to mutualize that risk is the process that was gone through, as opposed to some of the more liquid exchange traded products where they were simply either liquidated on the open market or packaged up and auctioned in parcels. But I could not be a bigger advocate where possible. And again, I'll cite something like single name CDS as potentially the exception, which is a whole different bag of risks, as the way in which this stuff is most neatly handled.
I guess I've been silent for a while, so I think there are more than two ways of splitting the baby here. So I think to some extent it's a false choice to say that, well, we either have a separate default fund for a particular product, which is well understandable if I'm a participant in, I participate in retail type markets. I buy and sell equity indices, I buy and sell options. I don't participate at all in the credit default swap markets. I don't want to have any piece of my default fund at risk because those crazies in the CDS market mess it up and the clearing corp can't liquidate it properly. That's a very understandable concern, and it tends to, I think it would carry a lot of weight, but there certainly are ways in which if the larger players who tend to participate in all markets want to sort of step up and take first loss for anything amongst themselves before the loss spills over to anybody else, that maybe the larger players can get the benefit of unified default funds and unified closeout procedures without it infecting some of the smaller players who might only play in one or two markets. These sorts of proposals haven't really been well developed. I know Mike and I tried to develop one of those years ago. Didn't get off the board, but I think the clearing infrastructures are just going to have to get a little bit creative to deal with this problem.
It was interesting. There was a study released very recently by a couple of Stanford professors talking just about this subject, Daryl Duffy. And one of the things they looked at is taking the bilateral trades and just bringing a bilateral single asset class into a clearinghouse reduce the risk. And beyond all the mathematical equations, which made the article a little tough to get through, not the most exciting thing, but they did come out and conclude that it's not necessarily reducing risk bringing one asset class to a single clearinghouse. And actually, the way that the bilateral counterparties measure their risk today, it's probably increasing their risk by having one asset class pulled out of a portfolio and cleared at a single clearinghouse. So I'm a proponent as well as bringing more of the diversification risk into clearinghouse, realizing that at some point you also there is a point where the systematic risk does get too much. You don't want to have everything in one clearinghouse as much as we'd like to have one single clearinghouse across the globe. There is a systemic problem of what happens if things get too big.
As long as it's ours, right?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't mind. As long as it's ours. But there is that issue. But I thought it was very interesting as far as bringing just one asset class into a single clearinghouse. Don't necessarily think, and I think we're starting to see some academic studies also reach that same conclusion.
Another tidbit, I guess, is I don't know what the total amount of collateral is on deposit at all the clearinghouses or all the derivatives clearinghouses around the world, but ISDA just published something that said on the order of $4 trillion in collateral is held for under CSAs in support of OTC derivatives. So it seems like there's just a massive amount of risk out there that's bilaterally collateralized, and they're relatively large portfolios that are bilaterally netted. And I agree. I read that same study, and a lot of banks had argued that if you pull things out of these very large bilateral nets, which have around $4 trillion in collateral supporting them, and pull them into many different multilateral nets, it's not clear whether you're increasing or decreasing systemic risk. But I don't think that's the reason why regulators want central counterparties for these instruments. They really want the credit rings, I think.
Well, that was, I think we've almost run out of time. We'll have time for a couple of questions because that was one of the issues that save this panel for next time on is are all products suitable for multilateral netting and central counterparty? But right now I'd like to ask anyone in the audience has a question for any of the three panelists, please. Mr. Marshall, of course.
Early in the discussion, the issue was raised about initial margin on OTC contracts, and that kind of this was the missing piece in contracts that are negotiated bilaterally. If we agree that one wants a uniform and sufficient level of initial margin for these OTC contracts, presumably the large broker-dealers would not be particularly happy with such an arrangement. And so what's going to push the market in that direction? Is it regulatory action, or would the buy side basically demand it?
I don't know what would push it in that direction. I was trying to be a little bit provocative. I mean, right now, the dealers compete a little bit on how fancy they can make their portfolio-based margining for their counterparties. I think, and I think though that the world's changing. I think they're not viewing buy-side credit intermediation as a business they want to stay in very much longer. I do think that it would be a very long time before there was, on a bilateral basis, standardized initial margin for these products.
We've dealt with more than a few sell-side and buy-side firms when dealing with credit default swaps. And it's been very interesting is that the sell-side folks, they'll give us portfolios, we'll run our hypothetical margin calculations. They're not adverse to having margin. What they are adverse to is having margin that is much greater than what they deem as the risk in the portfolio. So they will look at the portfolio calculations. If it's some reasonable amount, 2%, 3% on a very diversified portfolio, they seem to be okay with that. What they are very adverse to is when it's 15, 20% on what they see as a very low-risk type of well-hedged portfolio. So I think we're having a regulatory push a margin out there, I don't necessarily think is the proper thing or will necessarily solve the problem, because if they do come up with a rules-based type of approach rather than a principles-based, I think that will end up doing more harm than good.
I'd agree with that. The last, it's interesting what Pete says about the sell-side firms effectively competing with the fanciness of their models, and I'll take that as another way of saying competition in the area of who has the lowest initial margin rate, which is a road that we absolutely don't want to go anywhere near. There might well be different answers coming out of different models in terms of what's prudent, and that's fine. But the last thing this whole situation needs is kind of competition on who can charge the lowest margin. The only thing I'd add to that is to take the conversation one stage further. And like Dale, we've had lots of conversations with buy-side firms while we've been doing all the work in the last year in support of Life's contract, which has a buy-side leaning. And very often we go all the way through the conversation, and it's a very satisfactory conversation. And the kind of the wrap up of the conversation is very frequently, that's fine. Now, can we spend a couple of minutes talking about what my real problem is? And we say, okay, what might that be? And that's the buy side firms looking for a way of coming direct to clearinghouses because they just don't like the intermediate principal to principal risk. Under the existing structure. And that, I'm not going to pretend for a minute that I have the answer to that question, but it's just interesting that the frequency with which the question's asked.
All right. With that, I'm sorry to cut you off because we do have, the clock is ticking. I would like to thank Michael, Mark, Pete, and Dale for their time. All right, we're on break all the way until 11 o'clock, which is a whopping 3 minutes. We're all meeting back in the global ballroom. Thanks.
And that's going to do it for this episode of Options Insider Radio. Be sure to visit www.theoptionsinsider.com for more episodes of this program, as well as breaking news from the options market, the latest articles and analysis from options experts, a wide variety of options education, And of course, our discussion center, where you can share your questions, comments, and insights with your fellow Options Insider users. While you're there, be sure to register for our monthly email newsletter, as well as our free email alert system. Our email alert system makes it even easier to stay up to date on the latest content from theoptionsinsider.com. Thanks again for listening. My name is Mark Longo, and I'll see you next time on Options Insider Radio.
Options Insider Radio was created by Mark Longo and produced by Gene Crotty. Options Insider Radio is a production of the Options Insider Incorporated, all rights reserved.